Hello there. I think this is going live now. Just to share something with you while I'm having my morning cup of tea, which says on it, I love spreadsheets for some crazy reason, because I don't even know how to use a spreadsheet. Confusion about the whole King Arthur thing. I've been posting things on my Facebook page all about King Arthur. And I've noticed that I get quite a lot of angry people from Wales saying, oh, you're saying that King Arthur's English, but he's Welsh. I'm not saying he's English. Just sort it out a little bit. I do say that what was his Camelot, his base of operations, according to my research, is in England. But that doesn't mean that Arthur was English. Let me sort of explain it. The medieval romances that were written from around about early 1100s onwards during the Middle Ages refer to Arthur as living around about 500 AD. Now, at that time, you'll notice that in all the Arthurian portrayals in the pre-Raphaelite paintings and in the movies and so on, Arthur is generally portrayed as a king in shining plate armor. He fights with lances and a big broadsword and lives in a huge Gothic castle. That wasn't what England was, or Britain was like back in around 500 AD. The reason that the painters depicted people like that and the authors depicted them in a medieval style was because that's all they knew. They didn't know there was no such thing as archaeology back then. They hadn't got access to Roman records which were kept in Byzantium, and they weren't really available to anyone until Byzantium fell in the mid 1400s. So they didn't know. So it's the same reason why you see depictions of Jesus on the cross in medieval paintings as being surrounded by Roman soldiers who were wearing armor and helmets that didn't exist until medieval times. Okay, so that's why they look like that. But the historical Arthur, if he did exist, and I'll explain in a minute why I think he may have done, would have been very different. The Romans had left Britain in around about 410. In fact, that's officially when they left. But it didn't mean that Roman Britain completely finished. That's when the main armies went. But over the next few decades, the law and order in Britain began to collapse, and Britain divided into various feuding kingdoms. And according to the legends and according to the medieval stories, Arthur managed to unite these warring kingdoms against a new invader. Now, I'll tell you who that is in a moment, but just to clarify what is the difference between England, Britain, Wales, Great Britain, United Kingdom, the British Isles, which a lot of people get confused about, that live here, yet alone if you're from the US or somewhere. Okay, England is the country that was invaded by the Anglo-Saxons, named after them, Angleland. I'll be talking about this in a minute. Wales is the part of Britain that is now to the west of England, and it is a hilly country, mountainous, they say there, but they're not mountains by American standards, just very big hills. And in this region, the British people retreated when the Anglo-Saxons invaded and moved into what's now Wales. Scotland is the bit on the top that was never invaded by the Romans, and hence that's Scotland north of what was Hadrian's Wall, separating the outposts of the Roman Empire from the Scottish people. So Scotland is not part of what's called Britain. Britain is what the Romans call what is now England and Wales, the two areas that they conquered. They didn't conquer Scotland. That isn't part of Britain, although it was part of the island of Britannia. England, Scotland, and Wales are now what we call Great Britain, not because it's so great, but because it's greater than just smaller Britain, which is England and Wales. And the United Kingdom includes all those countries plus Northern Ireland. So that that sort of explains what's what. Now, how England came about is, okay, the Romans were here. They'd invaded what is now England and Wales up to Scotland and didn't invade that. They couldn't do it. Too mountainous. The people up there were too hostile. They didn't succeed. But when the Romans left, Britain was broke up into various kingdoms, as I mentioned. Now, what Arthur was, according to the various legends and the stories, what Arthur did was to unite the Britons against an invader. And this invader was the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Anglo-Saxons, from whom the English descend, or at least are supposed to, come from northern Germany and part of Denmark. The Angles from the bit by Denmark and called Anglin. And there's a place in northern Germany called Saxony, and the Saxons came from there. There were other groups of people that joined in with them, like the Jutes from a place called Jutland. But anyway, collectively known as the Anglo-Saxons, sometimes just referred to as the Saxons. But it was pretty much the Angles that conquered more ground originally than the Saxons, hence Angleland or England. Okay, they started to invade. They invaded what is now the southeast of England, Kent and around there. And they started moving across more into mainland, what is now mainland England. Now, did Arthur really unite these various fragmented kingdoms to an overall British force that kicked back the Anglo-Saxons? Well, somebody certainly seems to have done, because the archaeological evidence shows the Anglo-Saxons were pushing west, and then suddenly, when they were seemingly about to cut the British forces in two, somewhere around what is now the Bristol Channel, Bath, Bristol, somewhere in that area, they were going to cut literally the British forces in two. Somebody won a magnificent battle and managed to push the Anglo-Saxons back. Now, a writer that wrote within living memory of the time, a man called Gildas, tells us it all changed. The fortunes of the Britons went from bad to victory at the Battle of Badon. Now, it's possible the Battle of Badon, later Arthurian romancers, the stories in the Middle Ages, refer to the Battle of Badon being at Bath. Bath, the actual place, is called in Brythonic, the language spoken in Britain at the time, as Bathon, B-A-D-D-O-N. So it's possible that Battle of Badon, Bath is one and the same things. Even in German, it's Baden. So it's very possible that it was somewhere there. And if that's the case, Britain was almost very close to being cut in half by the invading Anglo-Saxons and probably would have lost everything. But it didn't happen like that. Archaeology has shown that there were Anglo-Saxon cemeteries close to Bath at one point, and then a few years later, those cemeteries aren't there anymore. They're being replaced by British cemeteries. In other words, the Britons had pushed them back. There is a monk called Nennius that wrote around about the year 830, and he'd collected together a number of documents that still survive from what we often call the Dark Ages, the period from when the Romans left to when the Anglo-Saxons first established the Kingdom of England. That's known as the Dark Ages. It's officially it's early Middle Ages, but I won't confuse you with that, because most people know the Middle Ages as the period of knights in armor and jousting and all this kind of stuff. Anyway, so what had happened the reason it's called the Dark Ages, incidentally, is not because it was particularly dark. Things weren't too good for a lot of people, but it's because it's dark in the sense of very few written records survive from that time. Again, the reason being the Romans had left. Very simply, paper wasn't being manufactured. People had to write on leather and stuff like this and parchment. There wasn't enough of that around. That easily rots unless it's properly treated, and it hadn't been in Britain at the time. So this is why there are very few records. Also, it's very difficult to get hold of anything to write with, making ink. Could you sit down and make some ink? Well, I certainly couldn't. So the only records are few and far between, and they're mainly monastic records. And they do refer to various historical events outside church matters. And this guy Nennius had collected together a number of manuscripts and wanted to tell a kind of history of Britain using both legends and historical accounts. Well, he refers to Arthur and he talks about him not as a man who fights dragons and rescues damsels in distress like you get in the later Middle Ages, but he talks about him being a warrior who united the Britons. He calls him the Duce Bellorium, or Dux Bellorium, it looks like, Dux Bellorum, Duce Bellorium, I think you say it, but don't quote me on that. It means leader of battles. So he wasn't a king as such, but it said he fought with the British kings. In other words, he united them as a kind of generalissimo or commander-in-chief. And Nennius refers to 12 battles he fought throughout the country as he pushed the Saxons back to the southeast. And he refers to the Battle of Badon as being Arthur's greatest victory. So it's a good possibility that a man called Arthur united the Britons around 500 AD and for a while pushed the Anglo-Saxons back. According to the Arthurian legends, when Arthur died, he fell in battle in a civil war fighting his nephew. Then the Anglo-Saxons started to advance again. This is shown in the archaeological records showing that sometime after the early 500s, sometime around 530, 540, the Anglo-Saxons started pushing forward again. And this monk Gildas, who actually mentions the Battle of Badon, who wrote within living memory of it, he wrote around about the year 545. He actually, his book that he wrote is called the Ruin and Conquest of Britain, and he refers to all the various kings of the country and how they squabbled amongst themselves, and their squabbling allowed the Anglo-Saxons to be victorious. Now we get to this whole idea of is Arthur Welsh, English, Scottish? What is he? Well, he's British. He's British in as much as what the Romans referred to as Britain, which was England and Wales. Now, gradually after the 500s and through the 600s, the Anglo-Saxons eventually, over the years, conquered all of what's now England. I think Cornwall was probably the last to fall. That didn't actually fall until the Middle Ages. But Britain was united as one country. But England was ultimately united by people like Alfred the Great. You've obviously heard of him, and his one of his successors, Athelstan, was actually technically the first guy to rule all England, although Alfred the Great is generally thought of as being the proper first English king that ruled the whole. They didn't rule the whole lot, but he pretty much did, and he was responsible for defeating at that time the Vikings and establishing England. Okay, but that's not until a good couple of centuries later. But after this, from around about the 700s to 800s onwards, there was England. And the people who had been the Britons had been defeated, pushed into what is now Wales. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person who was a native Briton ran into the Welsh mountains. No, the Wales remained free from the English, from being taken over by the English. But going back to the time that Arthur is said to have lived, then what was England, or the Anglo-Saxon part of the country, was just down by London and down in the area around Kent and Essex and round there. Nowhere in the middle of England. The people there were the people that later were called the Welsh. So even though I say, the reason I place Camelot in what's now England is the four largest and most successful cities in Roman Britain were London, Lincoln, York, and a place called Vericonium, which is now called Wroxeter in the county of Shropshire in England. By the time Arthur's kicking around, the other three, London, Lincoln, and York, have all fallen to the Anglo-Saxons, leaving Vericonium as a likely possible place where an actual historical Arthur would have ruled from. Archaeology has shown that at the time Arthur lived, 500 to 520, the place was massively refortified, and a kind of palatial mansion was built at the centre of it, which is considered to be the residence of an important warlord. at exactly the time that an important warlord seems to have united the Britons. Now, I'm not going to go into any more of it now. Just that is where I think that Arthur came. When he had his Camelot, so to speak. There's no need to say, well, hold on, that's not called Camelot. Well, Camelot is basically a made-up name in the Middle Ages. A poet decided to have he needed some word to rhyme with Lancelot, hence Camelot. Something like the almost like the Monty Python team and Spamalot to rhyme with Camelot. But that's so whatever the place was called, it wasn't Camelot. And in fact, in the earliest stories of King Arthur, he rules from a magnificent city, but we're not told its name. So this would have not been a huge Gothic castle. People would not have been dressed in plate armor. They would have been dressed, the soldiers would have been dressed sort of Roman style. And the kind of places that fortifications would have been wooden stockades and earthen embankments, but there would have been some stone buildings. Anyway, so Arthur was a Briton. Clearly, this is what people like Nennius tell us. He fought with the British kings. He united them. His centre of operations may have been in what's now England, but all of that then was Britain. And when the English pushed the British further to the west, they ended up in Wales. So the answer is Arthur was Welsh, but he lived in England, although he probably fought all over the place, according to what Nennius says. I hope that solves a problem. I'm certainly not taking Arthur away from the Welsh. I'm in fact trying to let people realise that Wales, if you want to call it that, was once the whole of what is now England and Wales. And it doesn't mean to say everybody who used to be British left and moved to Wales. People who are now English are a combination of descendants from the Anglo-Saxons, the Britons or the Welsh, the Vikings who overtook half the country at one point, the later French or the Normans that were the last people to conquer England in 1066. People like me are a combination of all of this, which is probably why I can be so confusing sometimes. Anyway, that's about it. Did anybody ask any questions? Morning, Graham, says Ian. Hello. Greetings from North Wales. Hello. Creating my reality. Ian again. They feel like mountains when you're cycling up. I would imagine they probably do. Anyway, bye for the moment. Let me switch this off. There we go. Bye-bye. No, can't. There. Bye.